This is the Mobile Tech Podcast, brought to you by worldpodcasts.com. Now here's your host, Tech Girl, Miriam Joie.
Brought to you by MediaTek. Hi, and welcome to the Mobile Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Miriam Joie, and today is Wednesday, August 4th, 2021. And I have a couple of very special guests today. I have James Chen of MediaTek here, and David Ruddock is going to be joining us later in the show to go over the news and reviews of the week. James, you're with MediaTek, and you and I want to talk about Wi-Fi today because it turns out it's the unsung hero of the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you there, Miriam. Wi-Fi is the unsung hero. I mean, we use it every day. In fact, I think the Wi-Fi industry is a victim of our own success. You know, when technology becomes so successful and so embedded into so many things and so ubiquitous, we kind of just take it for granted because it's just all around us, right? And it's sustained just about everything that we do, regardless if it's work, play, or anything in between. So yeah, MediaTek, we're very proud of our Wi-Fi. We've been doing Wi-Fi for close to 20 years, providing Wi-Fi, high-performance Wi-Fi chips in the industry. As you know, there is a great deal of traffic that flows across Wi-Fi, and Wi-Fi itself is also changing very rapidly. We had like Wi-Fi 6, and then last year, boom, we had Wi-Fi 6E, and you probably heard a little bit about Wi-Fi 7, which is kind of just knocking around the corner there.
So speaking of all this, walk us through a little bit. Like, let's not do a history lesson, but today Wi-Fi 6 seems to be like the standard, and we're working on Wi-Fi 7. But I believe most people are pretty much using Wi-Fi 5 at this point. Can you kind of recontextualize this in terms of the old nomenclature, what we used to know as AC and now AX, etc.?
Yeah.
And I think, let's pay special attention to the Wi-Fi 6E stuff as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, you're right. Yeah, Wi-Fi 5, that's the new name. It replaced a little more of the technical name, which is 802.11 AC.
Right.
And that was I think the technology or Wi-Fi 5 that kind of broke the gigabit barrier. So that's Wi-Fi 5.
That added 5 gigahertz band support, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep, did that too. Added the 5 gigahertz band. And the 5 gigahertz band, just a bit of trivia, actually was started in 802.11a back in 1999, 2000. But it really kind of didn't take off. But, for your trivia buffs, that's when 5 gigahertz was used. But you're right. It took 802.11ac almost 15, 16 years later to bring it to the forefront and for everybody to use it. So that was Wi-Fi 5. And then obviously after that was Wi-Fi 6. And Wi-Fi 6 is known as you said, 802.11ax.
Mm-hmm.
And that, the transition from Wi-Fi 5 to Wi-Fi 6 was not as seamless as the industry wanted because when Wi-Fi 6 claimed to fame was, the speed is about the same, but, the networks are just more efficient. And when I said that, I was thinking, well, how am I going to explain that to just, beyond the techies, everybody, even the techies? And because efficiency is something that's hard to quantify versus raw speed.
For sure.
That was Wi-Fi 6. So, that brought with us some technology called OFDMA. It's kind of a mouthful. 5-letter acronym. But OFDMA is a fundamental technology that's also in 4G networks, LTE, for example. So I think one of the things that people didn't know that the two technologies, cellular and Wi-Fi, the underpinnings, what we call the physical level, it's slowly merging. And Wi-Fi 6 kind of took that first bold step with that OFDMA technology. That's another trivia question. But that was Wi-Fi 6. Wi-Fi 6 has been in the market, I would say, since, I think 2019-ish.
Okay.
Maybe 2018. But really 2019 is where we saw the flurry of activity. And then just to bring everybody up to speed until now we have Wi-Fi 6E.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Now, it's kind of a weird name, but I guess, we came up with that because the technology is still, the underpinnings are still Wi-Fi 6. They did the E to really denote extended, for example, extended spectrum, because Wi-Fi 6E is using the new unlicensed 6 gigahertz that's now legal in many parts of the world. And so there's a whole bunch of things we can talk about Wi-Fi 6E, but that's where we are right now.
Yeah, I think it's just mostly about making spectrum available in a very, very crowded area, right? Like 2.4 gigahertz, which is the kind of default for Wi-Fi, and then 5 gigahertz. All these bands, if you look in a high density population area, is
Yeah.
very congested. Adding a new band makes a lot of sense. So, do you have at MediaTek a concept of how broad the adoption's been? I haven't, honestly, other than a few phones here in my home. I don't have any Wi-Fi 6E devices, so I'm curious if you're seeing a good uptake on this or not.
Yeah, we are. It's been a little bit slow, like you said, Miriam. And the reason is, well, I think the main reason is it's just regulatory overhang.
Right.
The United States was first the FCC was first to come out. I think it was April of last year, April 23rd, if I'm not mistaken, of 2020, and said, we're going to allow 1.2 gigahertz of spectrum in the 6 gigahertz band for any device use. And of course, Wi-Fi picked that up. But since then, there have been countries who have approved it. It's still not embraced worldwide. I think just 2 weeks ago, Germany was the first country in the European Union to officially legalize Wi-Fi 6E.
Mm-hmm.
And before that, there were other countries in the UK, the Southern America, there was South Korea. But still, I think it's one part is the slow uptick is the regulatory body just hasn't, regulatory takes time. I think the other thing is a little bit of, I think maybe people just don't kind of understand what more spectrum or more interference-free spectrum, like you say, really means, right? Because to my mom, for example, I would say, hey, I'm going to get you a phone. It's got Wi-Fi 6E and a router that's also Wi-Fi 6E. And she kind of looks at me and says, okay, what will it do for me? I said, well, your neighbor won't interfere with you. Well, she says, well, I don't see my neighbor. So it's kind of so I think it if you're congested or you have a lot of neighbors, sure, that will happen. But again, it's hard to market a negative, right? Something for interference, but it'll be there.
That actually kind of segues us nicely towards Wi-Fi 7. In MediaTek's leadership in Wi-Fi, I think that let's talk a little bit about where we're going with Wi-Fi 7, even though your mom can't see the neighbors, as you said. So it's going to be another hard sell for her for 7 and for others, right? I think MediaTek is in a position to really democratize Wi-Fi 6E and 7 going forward because you provide most of the chipsets out there for devices that are used today. All the smart speakers and the set-top boxes and the TV streamers that everybody's using today mostly have MediaTek chips in them. System level chips, right?
Yes.
SoCs. And of course, they have Wi-Fi built in. In addition to that, you make chips for routers. And then, I want to kind of get a glimpse of where you are at with that, what we can expect from Wi-Fi 7. And then to kind of wrap things up, let's talk about how we can kind of benefit from integrating Wi-Fi and cellular together.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think Wi-Fi 7, it's still early days in Wi-Fi 7. It's still in the IEEE standards bodies, and MediaTek, we've been doing IEEE standards, like I said, for about 20 years. So we sent a lot of engineers who were defining the future, literally the future of Wi-Fi. Now, Wi-Fi 7, in our opinion, is going to offer tremendous advantages, and it'll be easy to articulate as compared to Wi-Fi 6E over Wi-Fi 6, because it is kind of a level set. And the first thing that it does is it increases the speed by at least 200%.
Wow.
So that's something I can easily articulate to anybody, let alone my mom, right? People's idea of speed, and so, it's going to be faster. How much faster? Well, by 2.2x. They're like, wow, that's pretty darn good. Right? So that's easy. So you get over that hurdle right away. We're not explaining OFDMA network efficiencies. No.
Yeah.
We're not trying to explain new bands. No, okay, that's okay. But raw speed.
We're sticking with the bands that we have for Wi-Fi 7 right now.
Yeah, so for Wi-Fi 7, it'll work on all 3 bands, 2.4, 5, and 6, and the newly minted 6 gigahertz. And the advantage of Wi-Fi 7 is in the 6 gigahertz, it will be transmitting in what we call wider channel bandwidths. Okay. So bandwidth is kind of like channel bandwidth is kind of analogous to the number of lanes you have on a highway. The more lanes you have, the more cars that can go through it. You can visualize packets going through. It's the same idea, same analogy. So Wi-Fi 7 allows for 320 megahertz of bandwidth, which is twice.
Wow, that's a lot. Oh yeah,
that is twice. That's like the Autobahn compared to just a regular interstate highway, right? So that's twice the bandwidth of what Wi-Fi 6 and 6E can offer. And the third thing, which doesn't get talked a lot about for Wi-Fi 7, is it really introduces, we believe, groundbreaking technology to reduce latency. With 5G, 5G really did a wonderful job of introducing into the vernacular latency. Because before then, I bet people don't understand,
Yeah.
what is latency? Is it late? No. But latency has become a very good topic, right? Things happen, supposed to happen when they actually happen. The difference is latency. So Wi-Fi 7 has small latency. It's supposed to improve gaming, VR, AR, you name it. And so, I think, it has just some substantial level shifted the improvements, some fundamental improvements, right?
That's great. So tell us a little bit about, give us an idea, an overview of what MediaTek's reach is in terms of chips and solutions and devices that use Wi-Fi that you're developing Wi-Fi 7 for. I can, off the top of my head, mention these things before, like the smart speakers, set-top boxes, and media streamers, but also routers, but also smartphones and tablets. And, you do it all. You do it from individual Wi-Fi chips, correct, to integrated solutions where SoCs have Wi-Fi systems in them, to like even small like microcontroller level things with Wi-Fi in them. So
you know us well. Yeah.
Give us an idea, like the gamut of what MediaTek's reach is there, and what some of the products might be that people might already have in their homes using MediaTek Wi-Fi.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, we have the industry's broadest Wi-Fi portfolio. I think a lot of people don't know that, but we do. Like you said, we do everything from the small things. Like we have Wi-Fi, one antenna Wi-Fi systems. We call it 1x1 into sensors, doorbells. We have a 2x2, two antenna Wi-Fi systems that's in your TV. There was an announcement between MediaTek and Samsung back in April. The world's first 8K TV with Wi-Fi 6E is powered by MediaTek. So then we have like things like 4 antennas and on and on. So we are in anything from the smallest of the small to sensors and doorbell into cameras to TVs to set-top boxes to in the higher end to routers. We did an announcement with ASUS back in April as well about how our Wi-Fi is in their Rogue and Tough kind of like gaming notebooks. So we're in that as well. We're in networking, of course, retail. We're in operators, so service providers, operators who provide the very internet access that you and I are doing the Zencaster on. Those gateways have Wi-Fi that use us. We are also in enterprise. So, and then everything in between, right? All the markets in between. And I think last year in 2020, we shipped 600 million Wi-Fi chips. 600 million. And that's not even including the Wi-Fi chips that comes as part of our smartphone, like our Dimensity 5G smartphone chipset.
Or the new Companion chips for the tablets. Yeah.
That was just announced like last month, right? Actually, 2 weeks ago or a week ago. But no, just last year, 600 million chips. And it's just a complete, very broad portfolio. The main advantage is that when we do that is that as you know, Wi-Fi has 2 ends of the link. There's a client, like your TVs and your set-top box or your notebook or your phone. And then you have the AP, which is your routers and your gateways. So we have both ends of the chips on both ends of the network. And then when we combine them together, there are certain advantages to having MediaTek on both sides. Right? Either it's lower power, slightly faster speeds, immunity to your interference from your neighbor, things like that.
Yeah, for sure.
And so there's a lot of value add that you can tell, that you can see that's pretty obvious when you have both sides of it. So so we've been in this for a long time. We have a very broad portfolio, and we're pushing the technology beyond Wi-Fi 6E. As I said, Wi-Fi 7 and what lies beyond that. So we'll continue.
Sure. What do you think the biggest benefit has been, not just about MediaTek Wi-Fi, but Wi-Fi in general in this last year and a half of pandemic? Like, I think for me, what I'm seeing is the biggest challenge is the number of devices on a specific access point router in a specific home, right? Like we've seen almost a doubling instantly of like between people relying more on smart home technology because they're at home so much and they want comfort and convenience. And the fact that everybody's working from home on tablets, laptops, and phones. And also consuming content simultaneously in different rooms, we're seeing, I'm sure, a glut of devices connected at the same time. How do you solve this problem? Is it a problem? And are we developing solutions? Beyond the standards like Wi-Fi 7, is MediaTek like coming up with some breakthroughs there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So 2 things have fundamentally changed during this pandemic, right? One is, yes, you're right. The number of devices that are attaching to the networks has increased because we're bringing in more gadgets, right? I, for one, bought a new TV. I connected it with an Apple TV. Obviously, has Wi-Fi to get, to watch Apple TV. But beyond the number of devices that have been added, the sheer amount of time that each device spends on the network has also increased, right?
Right.
Because whether you're schooling from home, which means your desktop or laptop is connected to network, you're doing that 5-6 hours a day, working, of course. Any social activities, my kids FaceTime with their friends because they can't go to their house, right?
Right, yeah.
So these devices are on also for a longer period of time. So you really have a phenomenon where more devices coming together with increased amount of time that each of these devices are on the network. So it's like the perfect storm. And so what that means is your network has to get beefed up. And specifically, upgrading to the latest standard that has more speed. That's great, like Wi-Fi 6 and 6E. And in some homes, depending on how it's configured, you need mesh nodes, repeaters or extenders, whatever you call them, to cover. You see these things are going, flying off the shelf. And so what you're doing is you're kind of making your home network into a mini office. If you think about it, you have workers, meaning, here right now, my two kids are downstairs. They're doing stuff on the internet. They're on summer school. So, we have 3 people actively on the house. When my wife comes back, there's 4. So it's like a little small office. And we have some repeaters throughout the home just to make sure, because we have 2 stories, want to make sure everything is, copacetic on both levels. So if you really think about it, networking has really been forced to mature in the home to almost the level of a small office.
Right.
But you don't have the IT guy there. So the networks...
Right, you need some automation to make sure everything works, right?
They have to get smarter. And the networks have to configure themselves, and they see an issue, almost anneal itself, I guess that's the word, by themselves. Or if they can't, they have to send a message, right, to your service provider. So, and then there'll be more services coming down the road, because I think we're going to be in this hybrid, new normal, whatever you want to call it, mode for quite some time. And people get comfort, right? After being a certain way for a while, it's hard for them to change. So I think this is going to be around for us for a long time, or some foreseeable future. And I think the networks just have to get more faster. You have to kind of understand if there's congestion and get it out of the way, which MediaTek does. And they also have to communicate intelligently to the cloud through your service provider, which our chips do as well. We have APIs that kind of communicate on the health of the network. Plug it right up to the operator's cloud, and they kind of look at it and kind of make tweaks on the fly. So these are all very sophisticated systems. And the most important thing is I don't need to explain them to my mother. It just works, right?
Yeah.
Hey, Mom, how's your Wi-Fi? Why are you asking? Okay, good.
No, that's exactly what you want to hear.
That's good. Yeah. And so I think MediaTek, really, that's our vision, right? We see new services coming into home because our work-life balance has changed through this pandemic, and it will be here to stay, which means we're really investing in new technologies to kind of beef up the network into the repeaters, into newer versions of Wi-Fi like Wi-Fi 7, and also a lot of software, a lot of intelligence. And most importantly, we work with our customers to make sure this all works seamlessly in the background, right? Yeah. So nobody has to know. They shouldn't have to know. Right?
So last question for you real quick. You at MediaTek have a ton of expertise in 5G, right? We've seen 5G across a number of chipsets, and especially on the smartphone and tablet side of things. How much are we going to see integration between 5G and Wi-Fi at the non-SoC level, in the sense of maybe at the AP router level, or in other devices that somehow bridge the gap and might even be able to communicate via both simultaneously to increase performance? How much of that is happening in the Wi-Fi field?
Great question. It's already happening. And so MediaTek, we have an entirely dedicated business line that's attributed to things like this. Things are outside the norm, shall we say. So we have what our CEO calls the 5G beyond smartphone. He doesn't like to use non-smartphones, a little negative, but beyond smartphone product line. And that product line, last year in September, we announced the world's first chip that combines 5G with Wi-Fi, plus some other networking technologies. And that was to address this, all of a sudden, this burgeoning need for 5G fixed wireless access, a home gateway. So instead of using cable or DSL or some wire technology like fiber for your home internet, you can now hoist up a little 5G antenna inside your box. It gets 5G in, that's your internet. And then in your home, you distribute using Wi-Fi. And of course, these two things, you have to put them in the box. So the box, can't be too big, and they also can't fight against each other because
Yes.
two radios inside the same box each kind of think they're Mr. Beefy, multiple gigabits per second. You got to make sure these guys play nice, and so we have a lot of technology, what we call 5G and Wi-Fi coexistence, to allow it to coexist peacefully. And so we introduced that chipset last September. And that was the world's first, I think, a solution for this 5G kind of this gateway with Wi-Fi. And it's been very successful. And that just shows kind of the forward thinking that we have. We're integrating everything in because we can. And we have the technology. And we see that this is not just a trend, it is a reality, right? Things go from talked about to trending to Insta, and then it becomes a thing. So I think this is already a thing. And there'll be more products like that from us now.
Fantastic. Well, listen, James, we've got to run, but thanks so much for giving us a good perspective on what Wi-Fi has done, is doing, and will be doing, and how MediaTek fits into this, because obviously it does extensively. So I appreciate your thoughts and your input on this.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me here, Miriam, today.
No worries. Thanks so much again for being my guest. So, David, you're here now. Welcome.
I am. Thank you.
Thanks for being on the show. So what did you think of this Wi-Fi stuff here?
I think that if I did not have Wi-Fi, my life would change dramatically for the worse in pretty much every way, actually.
Yeah. So we got a bunch of news, and I think obviously the biggest news, the one that you and I are the most excited about, like by a long shot, is the Pixel 6 announcement. 6 Pro Tensor chip. All of that is real now, even though, well, we don't have the devices till October, I think. Let's speak about that for a second. The Google PR angle. What's your take on what they're doing there?
Well, I mean, they've done this a few times now, right? To varying degrees. I think they are fine-tuning an approach they began 2 years ago.
Right.
Where they're like, okay, let's put out the phone before we announce it and see what happens. And they tried that because it leaked and it was a funny joke and everybody laughs. And then they're probably like, we got a lot more earned media by doing it this way. And then they tried it again next year. Because the virtual launch made sense, right? Like it just was like, well, it's COVID, of course they're going to do that. Well, duh. But I think what they've seen is what OnePlus has seen.
Right.
The more you tease out a phone, the longer people are going to talk about it. And it's very hard, I would say, for better or worse, to get the media to stop talking about an unreleased phone if the official source is still teasing out details. They are just going to be like, you know what, we've got to get back to the watering hole here. This is stuff people want to know. Yeah. And I think Google is doing it in a way that feels less baity than, say, OnePlus is. Granted, it is a much less inclusive approach than OnePlus is.
Yeah, no, I think it was good. I mean, I feel like we needed to get something. I didn't expect it. I think very few people got briefed ahead of time, and they kind of dropped it on us, which was like kind of what I think was part of the weirdness of it. I mean, as you said, no different that one time where they dropped like the Pixel 4 images or whatever it was.
Yes.
But I think still like it was a bit unorthodox. Then again, let's talk about the good and bad, because obviously we have thoughts and opinions. Haha. You and I, for sure. So I feel like on one hand, I'm very excited. Like I had Max on the show like a few weeks back, and you know, he's full of good news and interesting news. And he basically said, look, they want to compete with Samsung this year. He kind of broke that news on the show and said, Google's going to get really serious this year. And it seems to me that's true. What do you think?
Well, I think wanting is good. I think that is really, at this point, how I would distill Google's goals of competing with Samsung is really, well, it's aspirational.
Right.
They're trying. And I think with the Pixel 5, they weren't. So that's
they're pushing money into it. Like it seems like, their CFO said that in the earnings call. I don't think they've ever done that before, though.
Oh,
Have
I
they?
don't know if I believe that. I think that is good spin for earnings. I think that with the original Pixel, there was quite a sizable marketing push because it was a new brand.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the first time you get to introduce that brand to consumers and you make a big splash, and they really did. Yeah, you were at the event for the original Pixel, right?
Yeah.
They made a fairly big to-do out of it. It was a big deal. They had tons of people there to answer questions, all the hardware partners. Like, it was a very well organized event. They got into the nitty gritty really fast, and they got into details. And that was like when I was like, okay, Google's getting serious about the phone thing in a very product-y way. Whereas before it had been more like a tool kind of way. Like, we're really excited about the tool we've built. Come look at it. Then with Pixel, it was much more about polish, really putting something out there that's finished per se, even if the Pixel wasn't totally finished. But I think they did have a pretty strong marketing push behind it. Do I think it was as strong with the 2, the 3, the 4? I think the 4 had a really strong push, actually. Martha Stewart was at the launch of the Pixel 4.
I know. It was weird. I felt the problem I have with Google in general is that I feel like they're in their own universe. I mean, Apple, we know, is in their own universe, and we've accepted that. But it's taken me a while to realize that, when I was at Engadget years ago and I dealt with Google PR, they weren't quite that far out on left field. Like, the whole company was a lot more, they were always very arrogant, but not nearly as arrogant as Apple. And I feel now they're like...
when you say arrogant, I feel like I can name a name and I'm not going to.
No, I don't even want to say arrogant in the snobby way, but more arrogant in the we're too cool for school, and so much so that we're doing our own thing, like the hipster arrogant. And it's kind of endearing, but also at the same time kind of tiring now. And so I'm kind of at the point where I'm like, okay, just make good products, okay? Let's just deliver. That's what we want. And I think that really hasn't happened. I feel like they tried with the 1, they tried with the 2. The 3 was a bit weird because half of it was LG, half of it was HTC. And then they had the bathtub cutout that I don't know how that even passed through the pipe to the end. And then the 4 was very experimental. I got to give him credit for that, but I feel like it wasn't what people wanted. And there's some great things in there, but they still failed to deliver a competitive product. And maybe that's not what they were aiming for, but I always was under the impression that if you make phones these days, which is a losing proposition to start with, you want to at least be competitive. And so the 5 wasn't even on the map, in my opinion. I mean, it's a great phone. The 4A 5G, I think, is a better phone for last year. And I don't know what the 5A is going to bring, but I have a feeling it's going to be pretty good for the money. And then the next thing you know, here we are with the 6. And the 6 and 6 Pro are the first time, even counting the original Pixel, because the original Pixel lacked OIS, for example. There were a few things in the original Pixel that were like, But this, to me, is like, I can get head-to-head with OnePlus 9 Pro, Galaxy S21, maybe not the Ultra because you don't have the kind of crazy telephoto here, but definitely competitive with the Mi 11s and the Oppo Find X3 Pros, and it's finally there, right? Like, at least on paper.
Sure. And I think, from a global perspective, that makes a lot of sense. But Google is, for consumer products, an extremely North American company.
For sure.
Then maybe a little bit of Europe. Like, that is really their focus. And so they're looking at the American market, which is owned by Apple and Samsung, right?
Yeah.
We know that. And so I think when they look at smartphone features, they're mostly looking at Apple. And I think that's really what they've been doing with the Pixel line for the last few years. They've been looking at Apple's approach, which, we all know is more conservative. They bring things on a little slower. They're a little slower to try new technology. Sometimes they're ahead of the curve, but Apple usually waits and sees and, figures out what they're going to do. Like multi-camera systems. Apple took its time and thought about, okay, which way do we want to do this? And I don't think they really necessarily hit it out of the park either initially, right? I think Apple, they've been a little they've always had that trepidation about is this actually something people want, or is this new marketing hype?
But then they surprised us with things like in-body stabilization, right? Like that was like, what?
Yeah, and I think that's where you see a company like Apple play to its strengths, which are the creator market. Like they know that, hey, we've got these prosumers out here who are really the heroes for our product. And if they don't feel like that product is delivering a hero like video experience, why are they going to brag about it? They're not going to want to do that. So Apple looks at it differently. Google, on the other hand, doesn't have that audience. Like Google's audience is a bunch of nerds like us. Like, it's a bunch of phone geeks. Mm-hmm. And so do we particularly care about some of these things? And I think Google has a hard time reconciling, okay, we understand these people buy our phones and they really like them and they're asking for all these things, but our real, we're licking our lips over here looking at Samsung and Apple's customers and being like, but what do they want? Because there are so many of them. And that, I think, has really been where Google has been torn, is deciding, okay, we have to make, the core, the base happy to some extent, but we also really, really, really have to go after these Apple and Samsung customers. And I think what you see this year, and I think I've seen other people mention it, I think Ryan Hager at AP might have put the idea in my head when he said it to me, is that you see Google aiming much more squarely at Samsung this year than you do at Apple.
Exactly, which I think they should always have done, because it's hard as an Android maker, especially the Android maker. Like, you're making freaking the best version of Android. Like, right. User experience wise, it's hard when you do that to compete with Apple. Like,
it is.
I mean, aim your goals at competing with Samsung, which I think they're finally doing.
I think I think it makes much more sense. And I think that Google, like you said, there is that, I don't know if arrogance is the right word necessarily, but there is that kind of like humble brag quality to Google sometimes, where it's like, no, we're not concerned about that. Don't worry about that. We're concerned about more important things. Come over here and look what we think is important. And it's like, okay, I get it, guys. Like, you are among a truly tiny group of companies that are so big that you could probably release really terrible phones for 20 years and it would in no way hurt you.
Exactly.
Like, it would not have a sizable financial impact. So yes, Google, I think, to some extent has earned that confidence, but I don't think they've earned that confidence in terms of, we're taking on Apple, we're taking on Samsung. I think that is, if they are serious about climbing that hill, they are in for a long climb. It's not going to take one phone. It's going to take 5. It's going to take a long time.
But you got to start somewhere. And to me, This is the first time I'm looking at this and going, okay, on paper, and knowing what I know of Pixel software today and Android 12 preview today, I think you've got a very strong foundation here. And this got me excited. And a lot of it has to do with the hardware finally. I mean, they didn't talk about wireless charging. I bloody well hope those two phones have it, because everything else they kind of talked about.
They haven't talked about a lot of things, right?
Well, I know, but they talked about a lot of the, like, we don't know the megapixel count, but we know it's going to be a modern sensor finally.
We got the optics and sensor, yeah.
And we know that's going to be enough RAM, because they learned that lesson with the 5, and I think they've done a good job since. We know that the displays are going to be decent. They've already told us some stuff around that. So I feel like the few things we don't know, if they don't mess those up, I think we're okay in terms of hardware. And then the software, of course, if they can make their camera magic even better, like they're claiming with video, and if they can make the software experience from Android 12 sing on this thing as kind of like they've always done on the Pixels, I think we're going to have a great phone. And then, of course, there's the whole, let's talk about Whitechapel / Tensor. And let's talk about how Qualcomm's feeling right now.
So that whole thing, that's a whole other can of worms. Right? I will say on the imaging side that I do think it's really important for Google to sell the video story, because historically, Android's terrible at video, because guess what? Qualcomm's terrible at video. So like, that's really been the limitation on the platform compared to Apple, because Apple's had their own ISP architecture for years. And guess what? It's great. Works awesome. Like, Apple knows video. And I think that Google understands that they weren't able to get to the level they needed to with video in order to do that. So I think that really for them, that is a huge marketing point, because when you show your friends a video or your family a video, oftentimes the question is, at least if it's good or really bad, I guess, what did you shoot that on? And, I think that is a really important grassroots marketing thing, because, Artem, the owner of Android Police, he talks about this all the time. He goes to take photos of his kids in the backyard. Even in daylight, if there's some shadows, like getting photos of moving people, it's really hard on a phone. And, video too, like if it lags for like 3 seconds after you hit the record button, moment's gone.
Yeah.
Or the shake's really bad, or there's some weird audio artifacts, which have also been a problem on Pixels for video.
Yeah.
So I think that, this segues nicely into the discussion of Tensor and Whitechapel, right? Because Google clearly has decided that they are going to get better ROI out of starting to invest in some of the silicon themselves in terms of end user experience. They wouldn't do this if they felt like they were providing a degradation of experience. So that in and of itself does make me feel, excited and interested in what they're doing. Now, that said, doesn't mean it's going to be a bug-free or perfect experience.
Oh, yeah.
And I kind of doubt it will be. But I think that Google will have silicon growing pains, but what I'm interested to find out, as we all are, is for somebody to rip one open and be like, what's actually in there? And that's, the AnonTech and the iFixit teardowns. Those will really tell the big story about what Google is doing and what its ambitions are. They can talk about Tensor till they're blue in the face. It's just a name. It's not a thing in and of itself. Tensor, at least not in the way they're using it here.
Right. Yeah.
Here,
of course.
It's a marketing name. So, it may be that like what you do end up with here is the off-the-shelf ARM CPU cores, the off-the-shelf ARM GPU solution, and an off-the-shelf radio solution. But Google adds in little pieces, little modules of its own design. Now, there are some interesting areas where they could innovate. I think where you've seen the biggest leaps, I'm sure you agree, is in DSP architecture because of AI. And so much more silicon die area is going to these DSPs now because of all the AI operations and ML operations on phones. And Google, first and foremost in AI and ML, maybe some people would debate that, but I don't think it's up for debate.
No.
They understand this stuff so much better. And they've already proven that they can deliver real world AI experiences on a smartphone. Like they've shown like your Google Photos search is way faster because it's using AI to search them locally. Like it just knows to do that. And you also have like processing stuff like the image examples they showed, like where they're like, oh, this would have been a really terrible image, but with the power of AI, we were able to transform it into something that's totally great. It's a great picture. So I think all of that is exciting. I think that, Google has historically, to me, been willing to get a little too like Apple in terms of touting their own achievements on hardware. It's like, all right, guys, slow down. How much of this did you actually do? And don't get me wrong, building an SoC, even with off the shelf, is still extremely hard.
That's the challenge, right?
That's not easy.
Oh, yeah.
It's not a small accomplishment. But in the competitive landscape, that's not necessarily a huge advantage. That could actually be a huge disadvantage if you don't do it right. So I am cautiously optimistic because I think it's what Google needs to do. And I think it's where Google has been putting organizational resources beyond the mobile sphere because they know this stuff is important in a much larger computing sense. It's globally important. Like this is how we're going to scale a lot of things and solve a lot of hard problems, which is cool. But does that vision and the reality of, what they can do on a phone right now, do those meet in a way that actually creates a better experience with the product? And
that's going to be the big question.
It is. And that is the one I am kind of wait and see about because I want to see, hey, Google, you've said for so many years, I've just set off everybody's home.
That's fine.
You've said for so many years that, if only you had more control of the hardware, more control going down the stack, that you could do these things. Show me you can do them. Show me you can do these things that you're like, well, Apple can do that because such and such. And okay, that's a fine excuse. And I agree with you. Qualcomm is a limiting factor for phone OEMs. There are certain things Qualcomm is really great at that no other phone maker would be able to become close to matching them at, like modems. Like Qualcomm is making the best modems.
For sure.
And so, that's another obvious thing, but Google has to show us that they are able to bring something meaningful to the table and say, actually, we do this better than everybody else, and here's why. And I haven't quite yet seen that. I'm optimistic that Google will show us those use cases. Now, will they knock everybody's socks off? Maybe not.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's how I feel too. I feel like, the tooting their own horn thing has always been very funny coming from Google because Apple has actually delivered like not just great product, but sales that match, right? Whereas Google, the products have been sometimes great, not always. And I would argue that Apple has had a more consistent track record in the quality of its products. And then on top of that, they haven't really sold that many Pixels. But I think the other thing that you brought up that I think is important is that, it doesn't matter so much how this all happens. Ultimately, it's the end result, it's the experience. And I'm hoping that by going to their own silicon, we don't lose some of the kind of what we take for granted base experiences, that we just get enhanced experiences on top of what we expect. And that's likely to happen, I think, because if you think about it, that's how Apple dominates, by having that vertical ecosystem, right? So I think that by owning your own chips in a way, or design your own chips, whatever you want to call it, I think you're kind of achieving that to some extent. And there's potential there for, I hate that word, but great synergy, right? And so I think that's what I'm looking at. And I think that, as you said, until iFixit or XDA or, a non-tech or whatever, somebody takes it apart and looks, we won't know. Maybe it's an Exynos SoC at the core, with all that Tensor ML extra cores, and maybe for all we know, it's a Qualcomm 5G modem, right? We don't even know, right?
No, we don't.
What does Samsung do for their Exynos devices? None of them have 5G. Do they have their own 5G?
They do. They have low and mid band. Don't quote me. I don't believe there's a Shannon modem with millimeter wave yet. So there might be a reference design.
This needs millimeter wave, I think, because, if they want the US market, they need Verizon. And I don't see this, at least one of these two phones, if not both phones, especially now with Apple having all their iPhone 12s with millimeter wave pretty much.
Right.
We can't not have millimeter wave. So that's why I'm kind of leaning towards a Qualcomm modem.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing about that. So number one, Google, I bet like every other phone maker feels like they got burned on millimeter wave. Because, I mean, who wrote the article? Was it on Light Reading that they said mobile millimeter wave is dead? I think Mike Dano, maybe it wasn't Mike. Yeah. I think it was Mike. He finally wrote an article and said mobile millimeter wave is dead. And I was like, called it. And I think that's true and fair. Now, do I think that makes millimeter wave useless in a phone? Well, I don't know if I'd go that far. I've never said it's useless. I just think that the use cases are on the edge. And maybe they will get there. But to me, you're right about the competitive marketing advantage, where it's like, well, Verizon is not going to spend a bunch of money marketing a phone that doesn't have their fastest 5G.
Exactly.
Right now. Why would they do that? That's stupid. They're
1/3 of the US market.
Right. None of these carriers are going to step back hard on the millimeter wave thing until AT&T and Verizon get their mid-band up and running. And at that point, I think you're suddenly going to start seeing fewer phones of millimeter wave, but at least in the mid-high range. I think the super high-tier phones, they'll keep it. Qualcomm will make sure they do, because Qualcomm will price it such that it is tenable, because Qualcomm really wants that to happen. So yeah. I do think that you're right, though, the competitive marketing advantage on that side, but we don't know. And so, one of the things that I've been kind of miffed about, you don't think about the modem in your phone. Most people don't, but in the iPhone, with the iPhones now, I've noticed that the way their modems are tuned, the performance is notably worse than my Samsung phones. They just get worse speeds, worse reception, just work less well on mobile data, which to me is just mind blowing for one, and also frustrating, because I'm I have another phone right here and it works just fine on this network. That could also be because I'm running iOS 15 beta. But anyway, that is something that, I do think about. Do regular consumers think about it? No. Are they going to care? No. Is it ever going to appear in a piece of marketing material? No. But these are, I think little things that show you care. Putting a Qualcomm modem in says we want to use the best part that's available, because that's what the best part is. Putting a Shannon modem in says we went with the solution that was cost effective.
I really don't. I would be super surprised. As much as I agree with you that Google's been burned by millimeter wave, they still are going to have to include it in these to check the boxes and be taken seriously in this market, and to have that 1/3 of the carrier market that they need. Yep. And beyond that, also, Qualcomm, I kind of feel that to stay on Qualcomm's good side is probably important, even for Google. And as such, they've already pulled the SoC out of the rug from underneath Qualcomm's feet. So maybe by saying, oh, we'll use your modems, they kind of save grace.
That whole thing is going to be very interesting to me to watch unfold, because I can only imagine the drama of all this. Like, it's super nerdy, but at the same time, in terms of business relationship, Qualcomm and Google have worked very closely together for a long, long time.
That's what I mean, right?
Yeah, and that's going to change.
And they got burnt last year, I think, Google, because they were forced in a way for marketing reasons to include millimeter wave on the 5 in the US, making it $100 more. The millimeter wave tax was real back then. I think Apple has leveled the millimeter wave tax, because even with the S21, you don't see it anymore, right? The S21 is a pretty affordable phone despite having millimeter wave from the get-go. And so I think that's over now. But at the time the Pixel 5 came out, and of course, Google was frustrated, but they passed it on to the consumer, right? I think that the Pixel 5 would have been much more palatable at $100 less, like it was abroad, if it had been sold in the US at that price, and they would have had a special SKU like they did for the 4A 5G for Verizon, right?
Yeah. I think you're right. They should have called a mulligan on it and just said, you know what, we're just gonna eat it, and we're gonna call it the COVID year. Things didn't go to plan, and just price it $100 less. Which, of course, the Pixel 5, MSRP drops were almost immediate. So Google did exactly what it always does, which is just like, that's what makes it annoying, because you're like, listen, do not pre-order a Google phone. Just don't do it. Wait a month.
Just a month. That's all you need.
Just wait a month and you'll save $150 or $200.
And it'll be available again. Well, maybe not. That's the other problem. Availability. They really need to fix that.
That's interesting. So I think that is a really interesting question because of the chip shortage. So, Google people have said, oh, well, it's an advantage to Google doing their own shipment. That's wrong. That's incorrect. That it's a disadvantage.
It is a big disadvantage.
It's a huge disadvantage, because guess what? Google isn't ordering chips at scale. Like, you're not sitting at the top of the fab list. Like, they're like, we got Qualcomm, we got Apple, we got MediaTek. We're busy here. Like, your order for 1 million units, like, we don't even blink at that. Yeah. So I think probably what's likely happened here, Google probably got a sweetheart deal with Samsung's fab and said, let's try this. First time customer, get you in the door kind of thing. So hopefully they got lucky and do have adequate supply. Given the launch countries for the Pixel 6, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see how many phones are available. Everybody's struggling right now. And just because Samsung is making it doesn't mean Samsung can get all the little pieces they have to glue strip to the SoC. Like, you're missing one piece, phone doesn't get put together. Yeah. So that will be interesting to see. And I will be very curious if there is a shortage issue, because it's hit every industry, but phones have, at least at the high end, not been super impacted, because I think that the margins are so good that you can eat some of that on supply chain and say, guess what? We'll up our costs a little bit if it means we can keep supply coming. So I think they can push the top of the line, or the front of the line, as it were, a little more easily. Whereas a car company making a $24,000 economy car is like, we've got $1,500 of margin built into this $24,000 product. There's no more room to squeeze.
Pretty much.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see how the supply situation works out. I'm genuinely curious, and like it's been a bummer this year, because the supply situation with silicon has not only made some things like cars much more expensive, it's made certain other products just very hard to get. Yeah. Like if
PlayStations.
PlayStation's in-home exercise equipment. Like if you want, stuff like a treadmill with a big like smart display on it. Like, good luck. You're going to be waiting months. Like, it's not just because people want them. It's just because
webcams for a while.
Webcams for a while. I mean, it's affecting everything. So I will be curious how that plays out. I will also be curious how the pricing plays out. And what.
Well, look, actually, let's talk about that, because I actually think that this is an opportunity in terms of marketing to stand up to Samsung, especially if we know that they're going to discount after a month, like Samsung, that they should aim high. I actually think that you will have a certain cachet. If the product delivers, they could sell this at $1,000 for the 6 and $1,200 or something for the 6 Pro, and people would go, oh my freaking God. But then people would do what they did with Apple and Samsung, which was, well, okay, I guess that's what it is.
Yeah, I think so. And
then the prices would drop on sale, the carriers would have deals, and then it would all work, right? I think because especially in the US, people buy subsidized. So the carriers, all three better be on board. If Google does not have the carriers on this, we're effed.
Yeah, and I'm sure they are. I would be so shocked if, well, I mean, T-Mobile is the one wild card to me. I guarantee Verizon's selling this thing, and I guarantee I would be shocked if AT&T doesn't sell it.
Well, yeah, me too. But at the same time, AT&T hasn't supported almost any unlocked phones on the market except for Samsung and Apple lately. So
yeah. I think that's a function of 5G transition, because it was the same way with AT&T and 4G. They were like, nothing works on our 4G network, and they held that line for quite a while back in the day.
The difference back then, though, is that you could buy an unlocked phone and it would just work. Whereas right now, they're actively blocking unlocked 5G phones with the right bands to work on their network.
Right. No, I mean, AT&T's always had a whitelist for I believe for 4G LTE, they did have a whitelist initially. I don't know how long it lasted. 4G HSPA Plus, you could just buy any phone and it should just work. Because I remember I had the Inspire HD Plus or whatever it was, something like that, or Desire HD.
Oh, that's an HTC. Okay.
Yes, yeah, that was one of the early HSPA Plus phones that could do like a crazy 54 megabits a second down. Ooh, I know. But anyway, yeah, I think the network situation in the US is such that we're seeing a return to whitelisting again. Like Verizon's always been whitelist. AT&T is embracing it with a newfound love, and T-Mobile generally is okay about unlocking, but they've started really clamping down on legacy devices. So I think all the carriers are, kind of consolidating ranks and saying, you need to, unless it's an Apple or a Samsung, you got to buy it here.
Yeah, as I said in the podcast, I think it was last week or a couple of weeks ago, you can walk into a T-Mobile store right now. If you play your cards right, walk away with money in your pocket and a brand new 5G phone.
Right.
Because they're so desperate to sell you a new phone to get 5G on your account. And they'll do almost anything. So just, ask something completely outrageous and see what happens.
Yeah.
But I think it's a good thing overall. Like, I was pretty excited. Like, I reviewed the Nord N200 5G a while back, and it's not the kind of phone that I'm very excited about. But then I got 300 down and 40 or 50 up in the middle of the boonies on mid-band, and I was just like, oh yeah, now this is exciting for $240. Wow.
It's funny. So I got, like I was telling you, I got an iPhone 12 Pro Max the other day, and don't worry, I'm going to upgrade it as soon as the new one comes out. I'm not an idiot. I'm just being frivolous with my money. But anyway, so I got the 12 Pro Max, and what I noticed, I live, relatively near the Cupertino spaceship, such that is my closest Apple store, is actually the one at the spaceship. And so I was testing AT&T there, and previously AT&T's 5G there was just like very basic low band, like 5 megahertz allocated, I think, and it was like whatever, like good signal, slow. But they, I think since then, have allocated way more bandwidth near Apple to 5G, because it now does like 250 down and 70 up on
I've never seen that on AT&T on 5G ever.
Yeah,
wow.
No, it really does. So where I live, at least, there are spots like that where you're like, oh, wow, it is really fast. Granted, you are like next to a microcell or something, probably.
Yeah.
But yeah, I did notice
probably
that.
One right in the spaceship.
There used to literally be like almost no reception right there across the street from the spaceship on AT&T. You can tell AT&T went over there and just like 5G to everything because they're like, we got to keep all these Apple employees on AT&T.
Well, rightfully so, right? Yeah, no, I think this is exciting. Are you excited about the Pixel 6 and 6 Pro?
I am.
I mean, there's a lot of question marks. We've kind of covered them, but I feel more excited about this Pixel than any previous Pixel. And I know there's a lot of hype here, but I feel like it's real. I feel like Google is somehow more serious, despite the arrogance and the Google-ness of all things and the way they do things there, and as you said, the humble brag and like all of that is real, but it doesn't, like, I'm a huge Google fan. I love their products. I use them all the time. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just being realistic. It's like, that's why Pixel's perfect for me. OnePlus is probably second best for me right now. But OnePlus is going in a different direction. And Pixel is kind of this 6 has really got me excited because I'm like, finally I can get an S21-ish grade phone for my needs without sacrificing.
And I don't know if you would agree, but my favorite phone this year has been the S21 Ultra. Like, that's been my favorite phone.
I have to agree. It's my favorite phone in every way except, I would say, 2. One, it's One UI 3.0 is I prefer 2.0, and the experience not really my bag. But the other thing is I don't want to be like everyone else.
Yeah, that's
like
true.
I just
Sure.
feel like they're everywhere. But I have to say, when I use it, especially the camera, I use it a lot. I'm just like, wow. Like, I mean, short of a Pixel, this would be my second choice. And then my third choice would be some kind of iPhone 12 Pro, right?
And so like for me, like I'm like you, and I just think like, okay, if Google can just do a periscope camera with their magical super res zoom technology, that's all I really want out of an imaging experience. And that's what they're giving us. So I'm like, great. You are, and honestly, because it's only 4x, that should mean the aperture is a little bigger. So it should be easier to steady, I really hope.
And if it's a 50 megapixel main sensor and they play their cards right with the super zoom algorithms that they were using on the regular pixels so far, with 12 megapixels at the source, we're going to get some really good zoom up to 4x from the main sensor, right? And then the telephoto takes over. I think it's going to be great.
Yeah. And I think that's dead on. And I think that's the reason they did 4x. You're right, because 1 to 4x super res zoom, like why would you don't want anything else? I don't need a dedicated 2x optical.
I was blown away when I reviewed the 4A last year, the basic 4A, and I took it to Treasure Island and took photos of downtown San Francisco on a normal sunny day. And I kept zooming, and I took some 5X shots, and I swear to you, David, they looked as good as some Periscope 5X phones I used.
Google's algorithms are no joke.
It wouldn't be that good in lower light, but I was just like, wow. That's when I realized, really, I hadn't really used super zoom that much, like A/Bing it with a real optical zoom. And that's when I realized, oh my God, if they had more pixels to start with, this would be pretty incredible.
Yeah.
So
definitely.
We'll see. I'm excited, and I just hope that we don't get something boneheaded like no wireless charging or no. And I hate to say this, I'm not a Verizon customer, but I want millimeter wave on this thing. I do, because I do live in a millimeter wave area, and if I can put a Verizon SIM in there and upload my videos in 10 seconds by just walking out my door, which is I've been doing, and sometimes I need to upload YouTube videos, and my internet, I max out at about 20 megabits. It's not that great for uploads. Yeah. So I walk out there, I put the video on my phone, and I go, all right, here we are. Bang, it's on YouTube in like 5 minutes, right?
Yeah, that is nice. And that is one of those things where that's also just a function of terrible internet infrastructure in America.
Well, of course it is, right? Like, I mean, literally, neighbors from mine a block away can get fiber, but I can't.
Yeah.
It's like they have gigabit up and I don't. And we're like literally 5 houses apart. And I don't know why.
Yeah, and I have like gigabit down, but guess what? 40 megabits up.
Yeah, exactly. I have like 250 down or something. Anyway, like the reality is it's useful, but it's kind of ridiculous that I have to sideload my video onto a phone and then go out there, literally stand around the corner next to the Pico cell and do my thing. It's like, I feel like, my bathroom is outside in the outhouse. That's what it feels like. That's the modern equivalent.
You just need to come up with some kind of Rube Goldberg machine to send the phone outside and then bring it back in.
Well, honestly, it's just short enough. Like, I need a long pole because it's right around the corner. So what I really need is to find something that reaches around the corner, basically, from my house, because it's the perpendicular block to me that has the Pico cell. So it's like I don't get any of it where I am, but if I walk 30 feet in one direction, I start getting like gigabit. It's weird.
The promise of the future.
Yeah. Anyway, let's switch gears to some news items really quick. So, what's interesting this week, it's been very quiet for some reason. I think like Google just really nailed it with the Pixel announcement in a way, I feel. Because you never know when you plan an announcement that it might be drowned out by something else. And well, they pretty much had the week to themselves, because here's what we got for the rest of it. We've got the Realme MagDart with the Oppo under display camera, some Xiaomi and Honor devices coming, and then some price leaks for the Z Fold and Z Flip. So let's go through this real quick. Realme copied Apple's MagSafe phone puck thing with something called the MagDart. Okay, the name, first of all, like, oh my God. It's tragic.
Oh, China.
But here's what's interesting. It's 50-watt wireless charging with, using a magnetic puck.
Yeah.
But there's two pucks. There's a 15-watt super slim, normal-looking puck like the iPhone would use. And then there's this fat, thick, boxy, has a fan in it,
Yeah, I was going to
puck
say.
for 50-watt charging. It's very interesting.
I wonder, so my curiosity around that, I remember the first time I tried a wireless charger with a fan. It was Samsung's first fast wireless charger, and it had a fan in it. And I'm like, this does not seem tenable. But anyway, I was like, that's interesting. And at the time, this was like 5 years ago. So this was quite a while ago. And so they've kept coming. Obviously, OnePlus being the most notable user with their truly chunky wireless charger. It is one of the chunkiest things around. And to me, it's like, okay, what? So obviously, a little AC fan is going to be like super cheap. They're a dime a dozen. Like, it's a super cheap component. You can source it from a million other supply chains. So I understand the cost side of it. That said, the elegance of a passive cooled solution is infinitely greater and long-lived. And
especially when it's magnetically stuck to the back of your phone. Like, if you're just resting it on a stand, it's one thing. But this is kind of ridiculous in my opinion.
Exactly. You don't need to force like induction of air from the phone if it's magnetically attached to something. You have a heatsink. It's literally making a heatsink out of the contact point. So yeah, I would be curious to see like if there's some like, suspended liquid cooling solutions that come out for these charging systems, because there's got to be a more elegant way to dissipate the heat than that. There just has to be.
Use the cable as a heatsink.
Yeah, totally.
Maybe.
Sounds safe.
Yeah, right. Anyway, no, I think it's funny. It's very Chinese. This is what made me happy about it was I was like, yeah, of course, like they're just going to do something outrageous like that. It's like when Red Magic put a fan in a phone for the first time. Yep. Now, we take it for granted on gaming phones, but the first time they did it, everybody's like, you got to be kidding me. And then it turns out to be actually a very good idea, but it was a little unwieldy at first. I think this will evolve, but I wouldn't be surprised if the entire BBK ecosystem switches to some sort of compatible system here, since they're all kind of using the same technology anyway for their fast charging. Yeah. Speaking of BBK Group, everyone is doing an under-display camera this year. The Axon 20 last year, or 20 Pro, whatever it was from ZTE, was the first one. It sucked by every measurable, like the quality of the photo and also the visibility of the, whatever the area.
I don't think I've ever gotten a more lukewarm offer to try out a phone from a company either. There's like, you can try it if you want.
Yeah, no, it was bad. But this year it seems that, with Samsung rumored to be doing it on the Z Fold, I think they wouldn't do it if it was completely horrible. Yeah. And I've seen samples of the ZTE Axon 30 5G, which I'm getting a review unit of, by the way, and that looks much better. And then, Oppo just showed their version, and that also looks like, basically you don't see the area on the screen as much. The pictures it takes seem to be better. The AI they're using for descreening the shot is better. And then, there's rumors of Xiaomi launching their Mi Mix 4 August 10th. And part of that rumors mill is also because it's the Mix, right? Remember, the original Mix was the phone with almost no bezel. And obviously, you don't want a camera having a hole punch or something in here. So this would also have an under display. So we're looking at essentially right now 4 potential devices coming. Some Oppo in the future, some Xiaomi soon, and very soon the Samsung phone, and then this already released ZTE phone that has this under display. Do you think this next year is going to be under display year then?
It's interesting because it's one of those things where in terms of the utility of the feature, it's immediately obvious, right? You get screen back. And which is, desirable. So from that perspective, I've always been a proponent of this because I'm like, well, duh, it solves an obvious problem, this ugly hole at the top of the phone. That said, it may still be one of those things where there are too many sacrifices outside the use cases where you really want it. So, for example, a phone that looks truly bezel-less, or a foldable phone, or something that's a non-traditional form factor, where that might benefit from that. So I think, though, what we'll see, these will get better, right? These will slowly, they'll start to solve the problems. I think AI is going to be huge for them because just telling the camera what not to pay attention to and what to ignore is going to be a huge part of making these work. Letting the camera piece together what it can't necessarily see, and kind of do guesswork maybe a little bit. I think that's going to be huge. And obviously there will be engineering advancements too to make them more effective, period.
Yeah.
I do think that you are at an interesting point with this because you have an Apple versus Android divergence now, because Apple needs all of these Face ID sensors and they're working on shrinking those down, and I'm sure they will. But Apple's not looking at this from just the camera perspective. They're like, we need the whole suite. And I think putting all of that under the display is probably eventually going to be possible. The projector dot matrix, I don't know. I'm guessing that can be made to work. But I think that what you'll see there is Apple will move very slowly on this. It'll probably take them quite a while to get there. And B, I think that you'll see too much compromise on the image quality from a marketing perspective, and that this will actually have a pretty notable impact on consumer reception, because selfies are like really important to people, especially in the market where these phones are most popular, which is Asia. So I think that that is something that I would immediately have a lot of concerns about, and concerns that would extend for probably a long time. Is it as good as a camera that doesn't have a screen on top of it? And as long as the answer to that question is no, I don't know that you're going to have people saying, I need this, even though it's not as good. I think that, it's like, so it's kind of to me like the situation Apple got into with MacBooks, where they're like, they're so thin. You won't believe how thin they are. And then everybody's like, great, can I have a better webcam? And Apple's like, doesn't exist. Doesn't fit, won't fit. Can't make it, can't do it. And so I wouldn't want to end up in a similar situation with under-screen cameras where it's like, technology's gone as far as it can go, guys. We don't think we can make this any better. Meanwhile, better and better camera sensors that are getting thinner and thinner and more capable. And I just seeing the trajectory of selfie cameras in Asia alone has made me be like, no, they care far more about the image quality and the capabilities of the sensor at this point.
But you see, that is why I also think there's a lot of hope for this to be perfected very rapidly, right?
Sure.
Because the markets that it's like, the companies that are pushing this are in markets that are really needing this to work, right? So I think, look, I'm optimistic. I say I'm giving it 2 years before it's on parity with
that's fair.
The most average, normal cameras we have today.
Sure.
And it's, as you said, it's an AI problem. Like, it's a de-screening problem. You're basically, it's the same as when you take a photo at the airport, and the dirty windows get in your way, right?
Yes.
Like you see the dirt, it's out of focus. This is the same, but with an array of pixels.
Yes.
And so there is all kinds of algorithms out there that exist to do this. It's just that, are they fast enough? Are they good enough? And more importantly, are you starting with an image that's bright enough? And that's the other problem, right?
The light gathering issue is really the other one. Yeah.
Opening the aperture is going to help, and I think they can do that to some extent. Better sensors, but that's the other thing you can do now. Since there's no more restriction on the size of that screen on the display, the area, you could make a bigger sensor back there. So then there's a Z-depth issue, right? Of course. So let them fiddle. I think this is going to be good. I think it's coming.
No, I think you're right. There's lots of fiddling yet to do to either say this is or isn't going to work. So absolutely.
But I think Samsung will really be able to show what they can do. Hopefully, if the rumors of the Z Fold having an on-display camera is true.
Just to make it sound like I'm not being totally negging out on this technology. It's just did you? I'm pretty sure you were there at the first event Lenovo put on after they bought Motorola for, I believe it was the Z lineup. And they had that little demo area where they had the talk with the foldable devices, the prototypes. And that was, I think, for almost all of the tech media, especially for me, the first time almost anybody got to hold and fold a screen. Because they had that plastic, really crappy looking, 8-inch tablet that could also go into phone mode if you held it up to your ear and folded it backwards. And I looked at that thing and I'm like, this sucks. But at the same time, I knew this is cutting edge, straight out of the laboratory, literally not designed to be used outside technology. It's gonna take time. So with that in mind, I do think you're totally right that we're going to see a lot of advancements, and that a lot of the really silly problems that we saw, especially with ZTE's phone last year, we'll get over those. I'm sure we will.
Yeah. So expect this on the display in a bunch of phones. Xiaomi Mi Mix 4 is one of them coming up on August 10th. You mark your calendars for those of you Xiaomi fans. Also, Honor is now obviously making their own phones no longer under the Huawei umbrella. And so they've announced a while back that they're going to use Snapdragon chips and do Android with GMS. So that's exciting. You should keep an eye and an ear out for this company again. They've already launched a few phones with Snapdragon chips, but more importantly, the Magic 3, which is Magic is their flagship, is supposed to come on August 12th with a Snapdragon 888 Plus. Supposedly, it's the first phone with the 888 Plus chip, so keep an eye on that. The X20 is a kind of lower mid-range phone that will come along with it. Again, this is more like news items for those of you who are keeping track, who are not in the US and who want cool phones. Maybe we'll get Honor phones in the US. Do you think Honor should come back to the US? The brand doesn't sound weird. Maybe they should do something.
It's interesting. I think that Honor is going to be radioactive to US carriers for a good long while.
Well, carriers, yeah, but they could do the unlocked thing.
They could. They could.
I mean,
absolutely.
Like ZTE is doing with the Axon phones.
Sure.
I just finally got an Axon 30 Ultra, the one with 4 cameras in the back.
Yep.
And honestly, it's a great little phone other than the wireless charging that's missing. That thing is great. And it's not supported, by any carrier, but it's works on 5G, at least on T-Mobile in the US, just fine.
Yeah.
So that's cool.
I think that Honor could do that. And I think that from a marketing and PR perspective, it would probably behoove them to do that. Whether that's worth it for them, I don't really know. To me, it's like Honor is probably in the most chaotic state like it's ever been in right now.
True.
And I really wonder what their strategy is and what their goals are. It could literally just be, we have to get back to volume in China immediately.
I think right now it's survival.
Yeah.
I think that's all they are. I mean, it's fine, right? And I think they will. They probably have inherited a whole bunch of Huawei tech that they can kind of rebrand. And, I keep joking about this, but, in the back of my mind, there's still that conspiracy, which is all BS, but that somehow Huawei strings are still attached to Honor. And this was their way of getting out of this funk with the US sanctions, right? And that this, and it's,
I don't believe that.
I don't think so either. But if it were, wouldn't that be funny?
Yeah.
So the last thing we have, obviously, is the Galaxy event. The Unpacked is happening on the 11th. And there are some, I don't go by the leaks and rumors too much for these things, because Samsung leaks and rumors, it's like Apple leaks and rumors. I could spend every podcast and cover everything. But this is me interested in the sense that it might not be that these new fold and flip phones are cheaper than they could be, basically. My gut tells me they should be cheaper this year, that the only way you're going to democratize folding is by making them more rugged and cheaper. And, there's rumors that they might be more rugged and rumors that they might be cheaper, but then we saw some leaks of some pricing, at least in euros, and they're still pretty expensive. So again, US prices don't always translate. It's like,
No.
What is your take? Do you think strategically Samsung should eat some of the profits here and just go for a lower price, at least on the flip? Or do you think that they're not going to give, a crap and just do their own thing and
So number one, like we know,
make it expensive?
European prices always include VAT. So there's that. That always makes them look higher than they are. So I think that is one of the things to consider with all Euro leaks for phone prices. The other side of that could be that maybe Samsung doesn't see themselves selling as many in that market, and maybe they're pricing to the expected volume. I don't know. So I do think you're right that the way to democratize it, those are the two factors. It's ruggedness and price. You can make it last longer and you can make it cheaper. And those are the two things that I think make most people have trepidation about foldables, or that, too expensive and I'm afraid I'm going to break it.
Yeah. And that's kind of why I was going with this. I'm like, this is kind of conflicting with what my gut tells me, that they should be lowering the prices, whether they eat some of the profits or they actually are able through scale and manufacturing to lower the prices, because that would just make sense right now. If you really want to get the public on board on sexiness with this flip and productivity with the fold, you need to get them to the same price as a Note or an S21, right?
And I think you're exactly right. And I think that Samsung, so I think initially they really did have a strategy of limiting it to, super users, early adopters, people who are willing to say, I will throw $2,000 at a smartphone, which is a really good way to limit your audience to people who are true believers. Like you're just like, and that's good because that's getting you a lot of product feedback and also not harming your public image so much, because you have a group of people who are probably more forgiving with their technology to begin with and probably more careful with it. So once you start to open it up, you need to be at the point where quote unquote regular people can use these and not
the normobs, as I call them,
and not encounter the kinds of experience breaking issues that you might run into on one of the earlier models. I think based on last year's phones, Samsung got there really fast. Like they iterated very quickly, and I feel like with like last year's phones, I was like, no, you're mostly there. I feel like a regular person could be made to understand pretty easily what the limitations here are and how they should and shouldn't use it. A normal person can understand how to operate a motor vehicle. They can understand how to operate a folding phone. And I think we're at the point where it's not so expensive and not so fragile that they can, start doing that without running the risk of a major backfire in terms of marketing and PR if something goes wrong, because I think that's much less likely now. I think you wouldn't see like the, abnormal failure rates anymore. You wouldn't see as many dust ingress issues. You wouldn't see like the blotches or the lift spots as much. So I would hope this year is the year where they can start to lay the groundwork of getting into that wider audience. Now, that said, do I believe foldables? I'm going to ask myself a question, which I know is really polite. Do I believe foldables are the future of everyday mainstream smartphones? I am still not convinced at all.
Okay, well, let's end it on this, actually. Let's ask the audience to respond to me and David on Twitter and give us their feelings on what they think of folding phones. I'm a little more optimistic, to be frank. David, tell us where my listeners can find you on the internet.
You can find me on Twitter. I am back on Twitter. I did take a little break, but I am back from my Twitter vacation. It's RDRV3. And follow me there. And, obviously I'm the editor-in-chief at AndroidPlace.com. And you can find me lurking. Not really. You can't actually find me there because I'm not really on the website per se. So you do have to find me on Twitter, actually. You can yell at me there, though. I won't promise to respond.
There you go, folks. And you know where to find me on Twitter. I'm at Tankgrl. That's TNKGRL. That's both Twitter and Instagram. That's like the comic book character Tankgrl without the vowels. Pretty easy to remember. So if you want to discuss things with me and David, find us on Twitter. If you want to see pretty pictures of phones, pretty pictures taken with phones and stuff like that, look for my Instagram. And there are 2 channels related to this podcast. YouTube.com/MobileTechPodcast is the main channel. Has unboxing videos, some hands-on, some reviews. It's basically on-topic visuals that go alongside the podcast. And then there is youtube.com/MobileTechMore. That's kind of a new channel my producer and I are trying out. It's all the peripheral stuff, travel tech, car tech, home automation, all that stuff. We're going to try to ramp that up a little bit as time goes by. So please subscribe to that. We're trying to get to the 1,000 subscriber magic monetization point. We'd appreciate it. The podcast, as you know, lives at mobiletechpodcast.com. That's where you can subscribe to the RSS feed, or you can go to Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Spotify, everywhere good podcasts can be found, and subscribe. So please consider that. Please consider the YouTube channels. Tell your friends, all that good stuff. Also, if your podcast app lets you rate or review the show, please consider doing that. We now have a Patreon, so if you want to support the show, check it out. Patreon.com/Tankgrl, that's TNKGRL. A couple of interesting things there. There's a Discord channel you can join on one of the tiers, but also you can watch this podcast as a video, unedited, right the same day it's recorded, as an exclusive perk of a Patreon. So if you want to join Patreon, it's one of the things you can do. I don't have anybody to thank this week for joining, but I want to thank all my previous patrons for being on board and helping me out. And maybe you should consider yourself, if you want to see this video, join the Discord, etc., consider the Patreon. Patreon.com/Tankgrl. That's TNKGRL. And if you want to donate another way, there is a PayPal button in the show notes. So consider clicking on that and helping us out that way. And finally, I want to thank our sponsor, MediaTek. MediaTek is the world leader for Wi-Fi technology, which is used widely in global products, including mobile devices, PCs, digital TVs, routers, and hotspots. Its tightly integrated home networking and broadband Wi-Fi products are renowned for their high performance and reliability, rich set of features, and low power consumption. And so, I want to thank MediaTek once again, and I want to thank you, David, for being on the show. I appreciate it.
It's always good to be on, and I hope to be on again soon.
Of course, we'll make sure that happens at some point in the future. And folks, we'll have another show next week, so stay tuned for that. Until then, cheers, everybody.
This has been the Mobile Tech Podcast with Tank Girl, proudly presented by worldpodcasts.com. You can visit us online at mobiletechpodcast.com.